Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into an area that honestly, it kind of blew my mind with its implications. We're looking at how cutting edge military tech isn't just about raw weapons anymore. It's really about deeply understanding and, well, exploiting human psychology right there on the battlefield. Yeah, this deep dive pulls from a really comprehensive analysis. It weaves together, traditional military tactics, behavioral science, and even some pretty fascinating stuff from counterterrorism. Because when you look closely at anti-tank drone operations, it becomes obvious pretty quickly they're not just about brute firepower. It's really about leveraging very distinct psychological impacts. I was genuinely surprised, actually, by how deliberate these strategies are, how they're designed specifically to mess with the human element. So, how do these seemingly different approaches to combat actually play out, in the minds of the people facing them? Okay, let's unpack this. What seems to be at the core of modern anti-tank drone warfare is this really critical distinction. There are two main strategies. People call them DPS, or damage per second, and burst, which is more about high impact strikes. And these aren't just technical terms, right? They aren't just about how the drones inflict damage. They actually represent fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. And what's really captivating, to me anyway, is how each one uniquely targets human psychology.
That's absolutely right. It's a crucial distinction. If we start with DPS, maybe it helps to think of these drones as like relentless aerial mosquitoes. Their whole operation is about maintaining continuous pressure. They use things like loitering munitions, maybe swarm harassment. The immediate goal isn't necessarily a swift kill. Often they're targeting mobility systems, a tank's tracks, its optics, sensors, things like that. But maybe even more crucially, they're targeting the psychological state of the crew inside that tank. This strategy is really all about attrition. It's wearing down combat effectiveness through sustained, almost grinding engagement rather than one single decisive blow.
Okay, so it's like a constant nagging threat.
Exactly. And the psychological mechanism behind DPS, it heavily relies on what psychologists call classical conditioning. Through repetition, think Pavlov's dogs, right? When the tank crews face this constant drone presence, that distinctive buzzing sound itself, it becomes a powerful psychological trigger, sometimes even before an actual impact. It just starts eliciting anxiety and stress. Yeah, and this leads to some profound effects. One is decision fatigue. The sheer continuous demand for threat assessment, it depletes their cognitive resources. Then there's chronic stress accumulation. That drone sound, even if it's not immediately lethal, becomes this constant grinding psychological wear and tear. And then, interestingly, we often see two very different reactions emerge. Some crews might gradually adapt, almost tune it out, that's called habituation. But for others, the complete opposite happens. They become hypersensitive, making them even more vulnerable to the psychological pressure. That's sensitization.
It's fascinating how that idea, persistent pressure, it crops up in unexpected places. As I was reading through the analysis, I couldn't help but draw a line to something we've looked up before in a totally different context. Could you maybe elaborate on how these DPS tactics, how they sort of parallel insurgent harassment campaigns from a counterterrorism angle? Because the psychological impact feels really, really similar.
That's a very astute observation. And the parallel is, frankly, striking. Just like terror cells often maintain pressure through persistent, low-level attacks, they don't necessarily need a single massive event every time DPS drones create this sustained psychological burden. It's about creating a constant grinding anxiety, wearing down the opposition without needing a huge explosion each time.
Right. The constant threat is the weapon, in a way.
Precisely. And this psychological pressure is then amplified, often by sophisticated decoy strategies. These are designed specifically to stretch the enemy's resources and just saturate their attention. We're talking about things like swarm decoys, basically cheap, expendable drones sent out just to force the enemy to waste valuable ammunition, shooting them down.
Oh, clever.
Yeah. And then there are persistent radar ghosts. These are electronic signatures designed to mimic loitering threats, generating confusion, diverting resources, and also thermal signature amplification, using heat sources to create false targeting data, drawing fire and attention away from the real threats that are always lurking.
Okay, so DPS is this relentless psychological siege. It's constantly chipping away at a crew's resolve.
That's a good way to put it. A siege.
Yeah. So if that's the siege, what's the equivalent of a psychological knockout punch?
Well, that brings us neatly to the burst strategy. And it operates on a completely different principle, arguably an even more terrifying one. Burst drones function more like precision kamikaze systems. Their whole purpose is to deliver decisive strikes. They use specialized warheads, and crucially, they primarily employ a top-attack methodology.
Attacking from above.
Exactly, because the armor on turret roofs and engine decks is typically much thinner, far more susceptible to a single devastating hit from above. So the entire emphasis here is on immediate shock effect, a sudden, overwhelming strike.
Okay, so less grinding down, more sudden shock and awe.
Precisely. And the psychological mechanism for burst is different too. It primarily works through what we call operant conditioning, but via these intense shock events. This approach specifically exploits several human vulnerabilities. First, the acute stress response. Those sudden, unpredictable strikes create immediate, profound psychological trauma.
Just the sheer shock of it.
Absolutely. Then we also see fear conditioning. Survivors, after experiencing such a devastating event, they often develop this intense anticipatory anxiety towards all aerial threats, real or perceived. And finally, there's cognitive overload. Because the split-second decisions required during such an attack, they often exceed our human processing capacity. It can lead to paralysis, freezing up.
That's genuinely chilling. When you describe that psychological ripple effect, the sudden, overwhelming strike, what comes to mind for you as maybe a non-military parallel, perhaps from that counterterrorism world again? Because it feels like the intent there goes way beyond just the immediate target.
It absolutely does. And you're right. The counterterrorism parallel here is stark. It really directly mirrors suicide bomber methodology. The psychological impact is designed to extend far, far beyond the immediate targets. It's meant to create a disproportionate amount of fear. Enough fear that it can affect entire formations, paralyzing decision-making, spreading panic, eroding morale across the board, even among those who weren't directly hit.
Wow, that's potent.
It is. And this is precisely why burst decoys are designed differently, too. They aim to exploit timing vulnerabilities and saturate defenses very quickly. So you see things like false wave attacks. Initial decoy swarms are sent in specifically to trigger active protection systems prematurely.
Ah, so they waste their shot.
Exactly. Leaving the primary, real attack wave unhindered just moments later. There's also thermal and visual misdirection, using heat signatures, visual decoys, to mask the true strike vectors, make it harder to see where the real hit is coming from. And something called sequential deception, using dummy explosions first to sort of condition crews to maybe underestimate subsequent threats, thinking it's just another decoy run, until it isn't.
So, okay, if you're on the receiving end of these tactics, DPS or bursts, or maybe even both, and they're clearly targeting your mind as much as your machine, what does this mean for defense? How do you even start to counter a threat that's messing with your psychology so directly?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, really. And it brings us to CUAS applications, counter-uncrewed aerial systems. These systems are being developed and tailored specifically to counter each type of drone threat we've just discussed.
Okay, so different defenses for different attacks.
Precisely. When you're defending against those persistent DPS threats, the mosquitoes, the core strategy revolves around layered persistence in your defense. This can involve things like electronic warfare jamming, continuous radio frequency disruption to break up swarm coordination, communication.
Okay, like jamming their signals.
Right. Then you have hunter-killer patrols. These are basically specialized counter-drone swarms whose job is to actively maintain air superiority against these persistent threats, drone versus drone. And finally, expendable interceptors. Think cost-effective kinetic solutions, basically, cheap missiles or drones designed specifically for swarm attrition, to wear down the attacking drone force over time, matching their persistence.
Okay, fighting persistence with persistence makes sense. What about burst? That needs a faster reaction, right?
Absolutely. Defending against burst threats demands a completely different approach. Rapid response capability. Speed is everything. This includes things like active protection systems, APS. You might have heard of systems like Trophy or Iron Fist. These are hard-kill interceptors. They physically shoot down incoming projectiles like missiles or these burst drones in milliseconds.
Wow, split-second stuff.
Very much so. High-energy lasers are also a key area of development here. Directed energy weapons for those incredibly fast split-second engagements, zapping them out of the sky. And crucially, AI-enabled detection, using machine learning systems for predictive threat identification, trying to anticipate attacks even before they fully materialize, giving those defenses precious extra moments to react.
AI predicting the strike.
Incredible.
It's where things are heading. And what's truly remarkable here, really tying everything together, is how both of these strategies, DPS and burst, they fundamentally exploit very specific human vulnerabilities, human limits. They're not just about hitting a piece of metal. They're profoundly about influencing, maybe even manipulating the human mind operating that metal. So it really comes back to psychology.
It really does. The conditioning mechanisms are incredibly clear when you look at it. DPS operations, through that persistent grinding exposure, they seem designed to foster a sense of learned helplessness in crews. That feeling that escape or effective action is futile, leading to passivity, maybe even surrender.
Giving up mentally.
Yeah. On the other hand, burst operations, they seem designed to generate acute trauma responses. Very similar, actually, to the triggers we see in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, because they're so sudden, overwhelming, and unpredictable.
That makes sense. And the cognitive load.
Both strategies exploit our limits in processing information expertly. You see attention saturation, multiple threats, decoys, real attacks, all happening at once, simply overwhelming human processing capacity. This quickly leads to decision paralysis. The intense time pressure forces suboptimal choices, or sometimes no choices at all. People freeze. And under that kind of immense stress, you often observe group coordination breakdown, team communication, cohesion. It just degrades rapidly, sometimes leading to chaos inside the vehicle.
What's fascinating here is, well, given everything we've explored, it seems incredibly clear that the most effective anti-tank drone doctrine probably isn't about choosing one strategy over the other, right? DPS or burst. It feels like it's pointing towards something far more sophisticated, like a deliberate combination of both, a layered psychological warfare approach.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. The thinking is moving towards a hybrid approach. Often, this might unfold in distinct strategic phases. First, you might see a DPS phase. This is designed to establish that persistent threat presence, cultivate those initial fear responses, wear down the target mentally, get them stressed and fatigued.
Setting the stage psychologically.
Precisely. Then, that's followed by a burst phase. This phase deliberately exploits those preconditioned vulnerabilities for decisive strikes, hitting them when they're already psychologically compromised. And throughout this entire process, ideally, there's a continuous assessment phase. Military planners would be monitoring the psychological impact in real time, maybe through intercepted comms or observing behavior, and then adjusting their tactics accordingly.
Wow, turning warfare into almost a live psychological experiment.
In a way, yes. It's adapting based on the target's mental state.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, this really presents some clear, maybe even urgent recommendations for military planners, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
It seems to imply integrating behavioral science training much more deeply into military education, making sure personnel truly understand these principles of psychological warfare, how it's waged, and crucially, how to build a resilience against it.
Absolutely critical. Knowing the techniques helps defend against them.
And it means developing these hybrid doctrines we just discussed, ones that fluidly combine DPS and burst tactics for maximum psychological impact. Not just technical manuals, but psychological playbooks.
Yes. And critically, it also means a substantial investment in what you might call counter-psychology. Training crews specifically in resilience against psychological conditioning, building that mental fortitude, mental armor.
Right. And what about the technology side? What does this push towards?
For technology development, the implications are equally vital. We're probably looking at a future with much more sophisticated AI-enhanced decoys. Think machine learning systems capable of adaptive deception, decoys that learn and evolve with the countermeasures, making them incredibly difficult to predict or ignore.
Decoys that learn. Scary.
Potentially. Also, cytological monitoring tools. Maybe sensors or analysis methods that could provide real-time stress assessment to gauge target effectiveness. Imagine knowing remotely exactly when the enemy's cognitive load is peaking or their morale is breaking.
That's ethically complex but strategically powerful.
Extremely. And finally, multi-domain integration. This means coordinating drone operations not just with each other, but seamlessly with electronic warfare, cyber attacks, kinetic systems like artillery, air power, creating a truly unified and overwhelming effect that compounds the psychological pressure from multiple angles simultaneously.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what we've uncovered seems truly profound. Modern anti-tank drone warfare, it's as much about mastering the mental game, achieving cognitive dominance, as it is about firepower superiority. It's this incredibly sophisticated fusion, isn't it? Traditional military tactics, cutting-edge behavioral science, even principles borrowed from counterterrorism.
Indeed. It powerfully reiterates the immense impact of understanding how even technology, Cold, hard technology, when wielded with strategic psychological intent, can leverage these deep human principles. It moves beyond simple destruction towards, well, mental subversion, which raises an important question.
Right. Considering how deeply human psychology is now interwoven with advanced military technology, what does this really mean for the future of warfare, even beyond tanks? And maybe even more intriguingly, how might these same principles, persistent pressure, shock events, psychological conditioning, exploiting cognitive limits, how might they apply in unexpected ways in other areas of life?
Okay.
Completely unrelated areas. Something for you, the listener, to ponder long after our conversation ends.